जय श्री राधे। जय जय श्री गुरु, जय जय श्री गुरु। प्रेम कल्पतरु अद्भुत जाको प्रकाश, अद्भुत जाको प्रकाश। हिया अज्ञान तिमिरा बड़ ज्ञान, सुचंद्र किरणे करुणा, सुचंद्र किरणे करुणा। जय जय श्री गुरु, प्रेम कल्पतरु अद्भुत जाको प्रकाश, अद्भुत जाको प्रकाश। इहा इहा लोचनानंदधाम, इहा इहा लोचनानंदधाम। अजाचित मोहेन पतित हेरि जो कहूँ, जाची देवलो हरिनाम, जाची देवलो हरिनाम। आजुरमति अगति सततय सतमति, नाही सुकृति लवलेश। श्री वृंदावन जुगल भजन जन, श्री वृंदावन जुगल भजन जन, मोहे करलो उपदेश, मोहे करलो उपदेश। निरमल गौरा प्रेम रस सिंचने, निरमल गौरा प्रेम रस सिंचने, पूरला सब मोनेर आशा, सोचरनाम भुजे रति नहीं होलो, रोत वैष्णव दास, रोत वैष्णव दास। जय जय श्री गुरु, प्रेम कल्पतरु अद्भुत जाको प्रकाश, अद्भुत जाको प्रकाश जय जय नित्यानंद द्वैत गौरांग जय जय नित्यानंद द्वैत गौरांग निताय गौरांग निताय गौरांग निताय गौरांग निताय गौरांग जय जय नित्यानंद द्वैत गौरांग जय जय नित्यानंद द्वैत गौरांग जय जय जसोदानंदन शचीसुता गौरचंद्र जय जय रहीनि नंदन बलराम नित्यानंद जय जय महाविष्णुरवतार श्री अद्वैत चंद्र जय जय गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद जय जय खंडवासी नर हरि मुरारी मुकुंद जय जय स्वरूप रूप सनातन राय रामानंद जय जय उरिया गोरिया जोतो गौर भक्तवृंद जय जय हयाचे न हबेन যত गौर भक्तवृंद তোমরা সবাই মিলি করো দয়া আমি অতি মন্দ যেন আকুল প্রাণে গাইতে পারি হানিতাই গৌরাঙ্গ যেন জন্মে জন্মে গাইতে পারি হানিতাই গৌরাঙ্গ গাই যেন হানিতাই গৌরাঙ্গ জন্মে জন্মে হানিতাই গৌরাঙ্গ আকুল প্রাণে হানিতাই গৌরাঙ্গ নেচে নেচে হানিতাই গৌরাঙ্গ বাহু তুলে হানিতাই গৌরাঙ্গ জয় জয় নিত্যানন্দ দ্বৈত गौरांग जय जय नित्यानंद द्वैत गौरांग निताय 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 गौरांग जय जय नित्यानंद द्वैत गौरांग जय जय नित्यानंद द्वैत गौरांग Namasrashtam manumapi shachi putramatra swarupam Rupam tasyagrajamurupurim maturim poshtavatim Radha kundam girivaramaho radhika madhavasam Prapto yasya prasita kripaya Sri Gurum Tanato Sri Krishna Krishna Chaitanya Sasanatana Rupaka Gopala Raghunatapta Braja Ballabha Pahima Yasya Brahmeti Sangyam Kvachidapi Nigame Yati Chinmatra Satta Yangsho Yasyanshakaiswair Vibhavati Vashayan Eva Mayang Pumangscha Ekam Yasyaiva Rupam Vilasati Parama Vyomni Narayanakyam Sa Sri Krishno Vidhattam Swayamiha Bhagavan Prematad Padabhajam Gora Shyamarucho Jvalabhiramalaya Akshno Vilaso Savai Pratyashang Sumana Falodaya Vidho Gora Shamarucho Jalabhiramalaya Akshno Vilaso Savai Nityanti Virashesha Madana Kala Vaidagdhya Digdhatma Vihi Anyonya Priyata Sudha Parimala Stomonmadabhi Sada Radha Madhava Madhuri Biravitas Chittam Mamakram Yatam Guru Shastra Shraddha Ruchiranugati Siddhiriti Me Yadetat Tat Sarvam Charana Kamalam Rajatiyayo Kripa Madhvi Kena Snapita Nayanam Bhoja Yugalau Sada Radha Krishna Asharanagati Tau Mamagati Ali Viparipalita Prabalita Sanandamalokita Pratyashang Sumanah Falodaya Vidhau Samodamamoditaha Brindaranya Bhuvi Pramo Prakasha Madhura Sarvati Sriya Radha Madhavayo Pramodayatu Mam Ulalasa Kalpa Drumaha Imo Gori Shamo Manasi Viparito Bahirapi Surat tat tadvastro iti buddha janaira nishchitamidam. Sakopyacha prema adhikasadubhaya sfurti kataya dadhanmurti bhavam prisaka prisakapya virudabhu. Shri Rasam Natulam Viparti Nitaram Ityudhava Kirtayan Yasam Angri Rajo Nanama Harina Yaksvena Tulyo Mataha Tasang Tat Priyata Sudhakaratanum Vishwakchakoraite Nanena Dugatam Samasta Mahitam Vandamahe Radhikam Prema Yosa Radhika Krishna Yugmam Swanandena Plavayitva Sakischa Shashwat Vishwanga Plavayana Suprasiddha Soyang Buddhingana Samidham Karotu Soyang Buddhingana Susamidham Karotu Jayati Jayati Namanandarupam Murare Viramita Nija Dharma Dhyana Pujadi Yatnam Katamapi Sakridatang Muktidang Praninang Yat Paramamamritamekam Jivanang Bhushanang Me Paramamamritamekam Paramamamritamekam Jivanang Bhushanang Me Paramamamritamekam Jivanang Bhushanang Me. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So we left off yesterday. So today is actually the third day now. So I'm aiming for 21 days. There's a saying that you do something for 21 days, and then that becomes fixed as a habit. So I'm trying to establish my habit here of absorbing myself in the Priti Sandarbha. And it's not such an easy thing for me to do. I have to be frank, it's quite the task for me to concentrate. I know that one of the things that Jordan Peterson said that warmed my heart towards him was when he berated his students for claiming to spend so many hours in the library and studying. Says it's not an easy thing to do, to concentrate on work. It's not an easy thing to concentrate on reading and to study. It requires, and it's especially, it seems that it becomes harder as a certain amount of pressure is brought to bear. At any rate, let's look at one thing that you notice we're having power failures this evening. Way back in the time in the 1970s when I first came to India, then power failures were just a natural, it was the default position. But now things are so-called better, we have more electricity. Today, it's about 40 degrees outside right now. And this is the evening, it's 10 o'clock at night. So we're really having a nice hot season here this year. The newspapers are promising rain every single day, but the rain doesn't come. Aha. And also, we are still in the throes of COVID-19. So we're in an attempt to escape the so-called real world. We are spending some time here discussing Priti Sandarbha. So the subject matter of Priti Sandarbha is Priti, which means love. So we're talking about love in a divine sense, love of God, and love as an absolute value that is all-pervading in time and space. That is the goal of Krishna Bhakti. So what's happening here, what we're reading now, I started reading this one yesterday. This is Ajamila, the story of Ajamila. What Jiva Goswami is pointing out here is that in these descriptions, we already saw previously with Kardama, and now we're seeing with Ajamila, that he actually goes through Brahma realization, Paramatma realization, and Bhagavan realization as a kind of a krama, as a kind of a procedure, a process of development. So now how seriously are we to take that? Well, generally speaking, Vaishnavas don't take it that seriously because after all, Brahma, the stage of Brahma realization is something that's temporary, that just one passes through. But one has to understand that if one's Bhagavan realization without the Brahma realization, the mukti, even including Sayujya mukti, are all more or less prerequisites for the stage of bhakti. By engaging in, if one is not liberated, one has not got samipya, and how will one be rewarded of perceiving Krishna with his senses? If he doesn't have salokya, how will he have the affinity of a being one with Krishna in residence? If he doesn't have samipya, if he doesn't have proximity, how can he serve? If he doesn't have sarshti, how can he serve if he doesn't have the opulences with which to serve? If you're going to serve, of course, Sudama came and just gave some chipped rice, some flat rice to Krishna, not particularly for someone who, like Krishna, is enjoying the most opulent foods. That's the food of the poverty-stricken. And yet Krishna gradually accepted that. But would he accept like that every single day? Should Sudama become a Nitya Parishad of Krishna in Dwarka, and Krishna gave him the opportunity to serve, would Sudama continue to serve Chipitak? Would he continue to serve the flat rice to Krishna? I mean, even Rukmini stopped him and said, "This is not fit for you," when Krishna was going to eat that. So the goddess of fortune herself steps in and says, "This is not fit for you." So would Sudama have gone on offering this poor food to Krishna? Krishna is the husband of the goddess of fortune, so only the best for him. He is Bhagavan, Sharaishwarya Purna. So yes, it's true that he accepts the devotion. Patram pushpam phalam toyam yome bhaktya prayachati tadaham bhakti upahritam ashnami prayatatmana. So Krishna makes it very clear that he doesn't take these things into consideration. And all the way through, everywhere we learn that it's the bhakti that's important. It's the bhakti that counts. But what does bhakti do? Bhakti is the internal potency. Krishna is Sharaishwarya Purna. Krishna doesn't mind. He likes to be a human being. Krishna likes to subject himself to the vagaries of material life, because in those circumstances he can experience the exchange of love like a human being, the opportunities that human life gives for love, for the kind of sacrifice. That doesn't happen. How can that happen when you're living in the spiritual world where everything is going on since time immemorial, centered around Krishna and perfect Krishna consciousness? Then there's no comparison. That's what the statement of in the end of Brahma's prayers after the Brahma Mohan Lila. There, Lord Brahma says, Prapanche nishprapanchosi virambayasi bhutale. Prapanna janatananda sandoham prasitum prabhu. So there he gives the reason. I mean, so many reasons for Krishna to have an incarnation. And these things are talked about in several places in the Bhagavatam. But here, Lord Brahma, this verse is quoted several times in the Krishna Sandarbha, and it's also quoted in some very important places in the Gopala Champu as well. And there it says that prapanche nishprapanchos. You're Krishna, you have no connection to the world of five elements. But nevertheless, you enter into this world. And this is a source of great bewilderment to the people of this world. Virambayasi bhutale. You engage in these activities that are deceptive to everyone because you appear like a human being, even though you are transcendental to any kind of, limitation that humanity imposes. Prapanche nishprapanchosi virambayasi bhutale prapanna janatananda sandoham prasitum prabho. And the purpose of it is only to bestow upon your surrendered devotees special bliss. And a very interesting verse. It says about God, that God, and this is actually the theme of our entire Gaudiya Vaishnava and Bhagavata philosophy, that the human aspect of God, the personal aspect of God, is higher than the transcendent, demythologized, depersonalized, de-attributized, pantheistic, monistic, absolute, that is so the God of the philosophers, as it is sometimes called. So that God of the philosophers, that may or may not be realized. But whatever the case, it's not as blissful, it's not as meaningful, it's not as satisfying, it's not as coherent philosophically and theologically as that of the personal God. Right? It is that we cannot place upon God something less than his own creation. Right? God could never be less than his creation. So if humanity is God's creation, then everything that is good in humanity must also be present in God. That is where we look for it. Sometimes people say that man is not the product of God, but God is the product of man's mind. Well, what else would we expect? The Christians say, the Jews say, that God created man in his own image. And we say the same thing. We say that God and man, God and humanity, they share the same Sat Chit Ananda nature. But higher than this sharing of the sameness of the nature, they have the opportunity to enter into a relationship, and a relationship of love. And that relationship of love is actually the summum bonum of human existence. So, but does that mean that the Brahman realization is negligible? Actually, I was just listening to a Christian that I rather like. His name is John Lennox. He is an Irishman. He's a professor of mathematics, I believe, at Cambridge University. And but he is unabashed. He has debated with Dawkins, debated with Sam Harris, debated with, he's ready to debate with everyone, and he's fearless, and yet he's not. He doesn't shy away from the questions and the challenges that these neo-atheists. Christopher Hitchens is another one that he's debated. So in each particular case, he's found chinks in the armor of these four horsemen. There's another one, right? Hitchens, Harris, and Dawkins, and who's the fourth one? There's the fourth one in there. Four horsemen of the apocalypse. They like to call themselves the neo-atheist vanguard. I think there's another one also there. There's what's the name of that fellow from Stanford? At any rate, we don't care so much about all those people. But this Lennox, what he was saying about, he was saying, of course, that that this about the personal ideal of God, how this personal ideal was the only really satisfying response to creation. Anyhow, we'll come back. I think because I think that this Professor Lennox is a very interesting speaker and says many things that are useful to us in our current existential situation. Sometimes I say that when I went back to Canada in the 80s to study at university after a long 15 years as a practicing devotee in ISKCON and so on, and after ISKCON, 5 years in the Orthodox Vaishnava world. And then I decided to go back to university to study the Western way of looking at things and the Western way of understanding things. So at that point, it became clear to me, that in the modern world, we're living in a modern world where for the last 300 years now, there has been, a movement in the European and the European-derived civilizations towards what can be called the liberal consensus. And that liberal consensus has been a deliberate and onerous and persistent chipping away of all kinds of traditional knowledge and all kinds of traditional cultures and civilizations. Now, I don't know whether humanity has had its comeuppance yet, whether climate change and COVID-19 and a lot of other ominous rumblings on the horizon that in our current globalized world are much more ominous than they were if two neighbors bashed it out in a Himalayan village in the epoch before any kind of there was any communication except on foot and by word, by direct speech, or by perhaps by writing a letter. That time has gone. We've come to a point where everything affects everything very directly, where people like me sitting here making I can speak on a blog, and suddenly before you know it, person has millions of followers and is affecting opinion around the world. This can happen. It's happening constantly. It happens with great frequency. Andy Warhol said that everybody will have 15 minutes of fame. They have their 15 minutes of fame, and that's a turbulent situation to be in. And so it seems that everything hangs by a delicate balance in a way that we've never seen before. All right, so I want to get back to the Priti Sandarbha, and we'll see what is timeless and what is a product of history. Sa tasmin deva sadane asino yogamastitaha pratyahritendriya gramo yuyoja mana atmani. So see, several times he uses verbs related to yuj, which is the verb that source for yoga. And he mentions also some of the different parts, right? So he says asina, there's asana, yoga mastitaha. So he is situated practicing yoga. Pratyahritendriya gramo, he's repealed the senses and withdrawn them into the self. Yuyoja mana atmani, he engaged, he yogad the mind into the self. So there you have the atma. Tato gunebhya atmanam viyujya atma samadhina. So then he withdrew the atma from the gunas. Viyujya. I mentioned that, I think, in yesterday's class. Also, the Bojadev in his commentary in his bhashya on the Yoga Sutra, he makes a very famous comment that yoga should really be called Viyoga, because it's about separating yourself from the gunas of matter. And this is actually something that's very true about yoga. Yoga is essentially a negative process. It's about cutting oneself off, negating one's connection to Prakriti. So Prakriti Viyoga from Prakriti, that is actually the definition of yoga. So in the Yoga Sutra, you don't really get very much about yoga in terms of attaching the mind to Paramatma or to Bhagavan or to Ishvara. What one does is one persistently and continuously tries to stop the functions of the mind. So here he says that yuyoja mana atmani tato gunebhya atmanam viyujya. So once the mind was concentrated on the self in samadhi, then one separates the self from the material nature altogether through the process of atma samadhi. Samadhi means a continuous flow of consciousness towards one object. So then Yuyuj, again, Yuyuj Bhagavad Dhamni, then he entered into or engaged with the light, the Dhamni. Here Dhamni means light. Or it could be the Bhagavad Dhamma. The idea is that Krishna is effulgent, that God is effulgent, and that everything rests in his effulgence. And so when we talk about the light or talk about the light of Brahman, and that's seen as being simply the effulgence that surrounds Krishna. So that's called Dhamma. That's called Dhamma. So Dhamma is also, since the Krishna is always situated in his own glory, since he's always situated in his own effulgence, therefore his effulgence is understood to be his abode. So Yuyuje Bhagavat Dhamni Brahmani Anubhavatmani. So that Bhagavat Dhamma is Brahman, right? The effulgence. The Dhamma is Brahman, and it is also Anubhavatma. It is the Atma of Anubhava. It is the, here, Anubhava, the experience of consciousness. It is the essence of the experience of consciousness, of self-realization, we say, of identity with of the true self, the experience of the identity of the true self as one with the light of God, as God's abode, as Brahman. So that's what he achieved. And then what happened? Yarhi uparatadhi tasmin adrakshit purushan puraha upalabhyopalabdhan prag vavande shirasa dvija. So dvija means, this is Ajamil. He was after all a Brahman. So Yarhi, when his intelligence had become fixed, here he is using uparata. So uparata could be, just says that it's, that it's the chitta vritti nirodha, that had been achieved. So when he'd achieved the goals of yoga, then tasmin, tasmin is a little bit of a mystery one here. What does the tasmin refer to? Well, tasmin adrakshit. So I think the tasmin here means deva sadhana. It means there in right here, Haridwar. So adrakshit, he saw purushan, these purushas, these people in front of him. And upalabdhan. So he recognized them as the ones whom he had met before. In other words, they were the Vishnu Dutas. And so, Vavande Shirasa Dvijaha. So he bowed down to them, bowed down with his head. Hitwa Kalevaram Tirte Gangayam Darshanad Anu Sadyak Swarupam Jagrihe Bhagavat Parshvavartinam. So he gave up his body there in the holy place by the Ganges after seeing these Yamadutas, these Vishnu Dutas. And then quickly he took his eternal form, Swarupam, which Bhagavat Parshvavartinam, which was that of someone who stays eternally in the proximity of the Lord. Sakam vihaya sa vipro mahapurusha kinkarai haimam vimanamahruhya yayo yatra sriya patihi. So then the Vipra, this So then he gave up, so then in the association of these servants of the Mahapurusha, in other words, these Kinkaras, these Vishnu Dutas, they're servants of Vishnu. They're servants of the Paramatma ultimately. Right? But anyway, here it says that with them he got onto a golden chariot, a golden. Well, we're getting used to calling them airplanes, flower airplanes, and such. Well, Vimana, he got onto these celestial vehicles. Let's call them that. So he got on a golden celestial vehicle and went to that place where the Lord of the goddess of fortune resides. So that was the point was that he went through Brahman, Atman, and realization, and then by the grace of the Vishnu Dutas, he attained the abode of the Lord, Narayan. So that Brahmana, uh, so here he concludes what it was said here. It says, Evam sadyo bhagavat praptao api adikyam avagatam. So he was comparing this is let's say an indirect process, the krama mukti process, but the sadyo, the two are opposed, right? You have the sadyo mukti and you have the krama mukti. So krama mukti is when you take step by step, and sadyo mukti is when you go directly, do not pass go. Right? So sadyo mukti is the best. We often talk about that. So there's debate always is there. Is sadyo mukti actually possible? And so there's always an understory that in previous lifetimes he must have done so much in order to attain the qualification that he could get this kind of mercy. Because we can talk about God's mercy. This is another thing that Lennox was saying today. He was saying about God's mercy on the that this was that there's no qualification. I just slip my mind for a moment there. He was saying that Christianity is the only religion where merit is not taken into account. So, well, he explained that and explained it nicely, the idea. So in Vaishnavism also we have this idea that no jiva, this is, when the stress that is placed here at this Jiva Institute, there's a great amount of stress that's placed on the great subject that forced that resulted in Babaji separating himself from ISKCON, and that was the whole question of falling down from Vaikuntha. But the idea that bhakti is not present in the jiva, that one cannot extract bhakti from the jiva without bhakti having been placed there through contact with the Swarup Shakti. There's no way that any individual can come into contact with God except through contact with that which is related to God. So Bhagavan and Bhagavata. Bhagavata means something that's connected to Bhagavan. So you're never going to get to Bhagavan directly. You'll get to Bhagavan indirectly through the via media. And the via media is called Guru, Sri Guru. So this is correct. This is an idea that is actually very basic to all spirituality. And it's not a question of merit, but you cannot avoid the question of merit. You cannot avoid the question of merit. So externally, merit will always be seen. Internally, if you think you have merit, well, then you haven't attained humility. And if you haven't attained humility, that means you don't have real knowledge. What to speak of bhakti? So we say that there's something that looks like sadhyo mukti. Someone is more advanced. A young person comes along, and this young person seems to know the Bhagavatam right away, seems to feel devotional ecstasies right away. looks beautiful, looks attractive, has mannerisms that are pleasing, is effulgent and pure in his speech and behavior. You see someone like that at a young age and you think, my Lord, this person has spent many lifetimes cultivating what it means to be a human being. And because of that assiduous effort, lifetime after lifetime, Prakriti, the material nature, and the divine presence within the material nature, the Paramatma, are rewarding him with facilities in order to be able to advance even further on the path of humanity. So it's rather a neat thing. I mean, I know that there's another person who I've been listening to lately is this Yuval Noah Harari. And I must say that I find him rather frightening because he seems to be, he talks about the religions of the 21st century. And those religions of the 21st century, he says, one thing that he said I found extremely interesting, this was in his talks at Google, and he's saying there that the liberal consensus was that of individual freedom. So to maximize individual freedom through freeing oneself from all tradition, from all dogma, from all authority, and to become one's own personal authority, and to become one's personal authority also based not on necessarily intellectual achievement or learning, but just simply based on what one likes, that one's own preferences, one's likes and dislikes, those become the norm, that the freedom is sought in those things. So of course, this is the liberal consensus. This is actually what's going on in the world. I mean, he explains it very nicely, but he says that that is coming to an end, and that what we're seeing now is a change in society. That means that people are now ready to sacrifice their independence and their individuality to an algorithm, to algorithms. That algorithms are going that people will say, all right, if there's a 77.3 chance that I'm going to have prostate cancer before the age of 93, then maybe at the age of 91 or something like that, I'll have an excision of my prostate. In this kind of way, that because of through algorithms and statistics, one has more or less sold his soul in saying, giving up his independence to the artificial intelligence. So replacing God with artificial intelligence. It's a very interesting proposal, but I think rather a frightening one, if I don't mind my saying it. So the subject here, so I'm just talking about merit, that you have some, that the becoming, nowadays, nobody wants to, we don't have people are not believing, let's say, in rebirth and so on. Well, all right, this is something that we use to explain, but it puts things into proper perspective. The reason that Christians don't want to accept reincarnation is because they want to make the moment of surrender to God be the atomic bomb, or the great final moment, that moment of conversion. But of course, the moment of conversion is nothing compared to the life of sadhana. So what Lennox was saying that I have no merit. I'm a sinner, but by surrendering, by giving myself over to Jesus, I have the firm conviction that despite my lack of qualification, that he has accepted me and given me salvation. And so this is this is how I'm liberated. So he's saying that he has no merit. Well, that's his humility. So he says, I have no merit. And so we should all think that we have no merit. But if we look at it objectively, we say that yes, birth after birth. The Christian says, no, if you say birth after birth, then you can put off that momentous event. But we all evolve at our own speed. And there are no shortcuts. Even with God's grace and God's help, even with the sun of God's smile falling upon us, even so, we still have to struggle. We're still given the task of struggling. God still wants to see us struggle. Why does God want to see us struggle? Because he knows that per ardua ad astra, that it's through struggle that human beings perfect themselves. And without struggle, one becomes passive, one becomes dormant, one becomes flabby. One's life ceases to have any kind of depth. One ends up watching passively life go by. And indeed, what is interesting about life when there's so much more into which we can put our intelligence. So let's just go through this here. So that Brahmana, Ajamil, sat down there in that abode of the Devas, Haridwar, and took to the process of yoga. Controlling the senses, he fixed his mind on the self. Then, dissociating his mind. So the point of Ajamil's story, this is exactly what I'm saying here. Please excuse me if I'm not always traveling in a straight line. But here, the point of Ajamil was that he had already received the mercy. He'd been saved, right? Ajamil had been saved, and he'd been saved by a fluke, you could say. Right? I mean, the salvation, he spoke the name of his son Narayan. And because of that, the Yamadoots had to release him. So they released him, but that didn't mean that he went straight back to Krishna, right? He still had to do sadhana. So he went to the holy place, he went to Haridwar, sat down by the banks of the Ganges, and Haridwar is a famous place for yoga, Haridwar Rishikesh. So that place, that place is imbued with the sadhana of many rishis and munis who have lived there for thousands of years. It's been a holy place and has served as a center for sadhana for thousands of years. So that's where Ajamil goes in order to get satsanga, in order to be inspired, in order to follow up. You don't just get saved and then don't follow up. You have to follow up on your salvation. And following up on your salvation means sadhana. Because the demand that God places on you. So what have you experienced of God? When Ajamil saw the Vishnu Dutas, this is why it comes back here, right? He saw these Vishnu Dutas again for a second time. So, and then he bowed down to them because they were in fact his gurus. He bowed down to them. He calls it the Purushan. They're using those words, Purushan. Upalabhyo, Upalabdhan Prag. This is a Purushan. So this Purushan is not a small word, Purushan. It can mean man, but here it's something more, because he's already told us, that he's already Mahapurusha. Actually, in the very next verse, he calls Bhagavan Mahapurusha. Now, Purusha and Mahapurusha. Purusha doesn't, if you look in Sankhya philosophy and Yoga philosophy, Purusha means the Atma. They don't use the word Atma, they use the word Purusha. So the word Purusha is being used also in Vaishnavism, Purushavatara, and so on and so forth. But the individual soul is also Purusha. There's a Purusha and there's a Purushottama. So Ajamil saw these Purushas, meaning he saw these pure souls, these pure spiritual beings, these associates of Narayan, and he bowed down to them. Well, that's when the things changed, because up until that time, through the process of yoga, he'd had sakshatkara of Brahman, he'd had sakshatkara of the Atman. But when he had achieved that particular aspect of the goal, then death came to him. Then death came to him as a reward. He was ready for death. So he gave up his body. When his intelligence was thus fully absorbed in that effulgence, right? So controlling the senses, he fixed his mind on the self. Then, dissociating his mind from his body and senses, he fixed it on the effulgence of Bhagavan, Brahman, which is the seat of self-realization, Anubhavatmani. When his intelligence was thus fully absorbed in that effulgence, he saw before him the same persons, the Vishnu Dutas, he had seen before, and bowed his head to them. After seeing them, he gave up his body in that holy place on the bank of the river Ganges, and immediately attained a body like that of Bhagavan's, associates, riding on a plain of gold. I should say he embarking on a plain of gold. He, along with the servants of Bhagavan, went through the sky, Vihayasa, to the abode of the husband of Lakshmi. So he becomes an associate. So there he says, with the servants of, he went with the servants of Bhagavan. So it's an interest. So the story, if we could take out more of this story, if we say, yes, these Vishnu Dutas, these are actually his gurus, the eternal associates of Narayan. And they, by their grace, just by seeing them, and just by being saved by them, right? Because they chased the Yamadutas away. It was the Yamadutas who didn't understand what was going on. They thought they had free reign. So Ajamil was witness to all this. He saw the Vishnu Dutas chasing the Yamadutas away. And what was it all a result of? He said the word Narayan. Now the word Narayan, you could say, all right, it was pure namabhas. It was a pure namabhas. So pure namabhas means there was no namaparad. So if one chants the holy name without any aparad, even if one does so, sanketyam parihasyam va stovam helamnam eva va vaikuntha nama grahanam asheshagaharam vidu. It'll kill all your sins. It'll free you even from your prarabdha karma. Asheshagaharam. So this is what Ajamil, we say about Ajamil. That's the lesson of Ajamil. The lesson of Ajamil is that if you chant the holy name without any offenses, then you'll be relieved of all your sins. But what is the actual thing? So Ajamil, he is given freedom from his sins. He's saved from immediate death. We sometimes hear about people who say that, they had a brush with death a near experience, a near-death experience, it's called. And you have a near-death experience, and when they come back from that near-death experience, they say, for some reason, I was called to go to God, or I was called to the next world, but God left me, kept me in this world for some purpose. He left me here for some purpose. So yes, so the purpose is to do sadhana. Actually, life in this world is only about sadhana. There's nothing else. There's only sadhana. Even if you're a materialistic person, you're engaging in sadhana all the time, because I mean you're engaged in activities that supposedly are a means to an end. So even to have a moderately meaningful worldly life, you still have to have some pursuit. You have to have some purushartha. This is what I was saying before, that life without purpose, the vegetative life that so many people are now caught up in. So Ajamila, he chanted the name of the Lord. He was given freedom from immediate death. But what did he do then? He went to Haridwar, and there he started to engage in yoga, in the practice of yoga, in the krama mukti sense. The krama mukti sense was to first go through the process of purification. So it's condensed. This is what's going on through many, 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 many lifetimes. For the purpose of the story, and for the purpose of, a story, generally speaking, is a condensation. You watch a film, for instance, and only the important events are covered. You tell the history of the world. You don't tell everything that happened. Well, then there was an insect that was producing another insect, and then that insect produced another insect. That's not how you tell the story of the world. You tell the important events, right? Those are the important historical events that go and make up the meta-narrative of each person's meaningfulness, life philosophy, or worldview. So in the gradual process, first he went through the purification of identity with Brahman. And we're going to see this again and again. And we're going to see it again and again, because it does happen in various places in the Bhagavatam. This is not just in these places, but we'll see this again, especially in the 11th canto. So this is the point. So the point was that after performing sadhana, he comes into contact with the Guru again. So previously he had the Guru. First contact with the Guru was the result of Shraddha. So when after he, being saved, Jamil got faith. And that faith impelled him to engage in a life of sadhana for the purpose of attaining the self, for attaining self-realization. And that self-realization is attained in three phases. One is Brahman, one is Paramatman, and one is Bhagavan. Sri Jiva Goswami reiterates, and so the Brahman is the higher one. So this is here in the early going of the PRITIS Sandarbha. We're talking about something that is already fairly well known to devotees, I think. Sri Jiva Goswami reiterates that Bhagavat Sakshatkar is superior to Brahma Sakshatkar. He gives the example of Ajamila for this. This is an example of the gradual attainment of Bhagavan. Ajamil first had vision of the Vishnu Dutas. After hearing their dialogue with the Yamadutas, he left home and went to Haridwar to engage in bhakti. There the Vishnu Dutas came again and carried him to Vaikuntha. In this description, it is stated that he first had experience of Brahman and then of Bhagavan. This shows that Bhagavat Sakshatkara is superior to Brahma Sakshatkara. Otherwise, there would be no need to have Bhagavat Sakshatkara after Brahma Sakshatkara. Incidentally, it also proves that immediate liberation, Sadhyo Mukti, is superior to gradual liberation, Krama Mukti. Why not reach the destination immediately instead of wasting time in intermediate steps? This last point is very, very important. So what I was saying, I'm saying that, that we're talking about Sadhya Mukti and we're talking about Krama Mukti, but in all likelihood, over the course of millions of lifetimes, this process of krama has been going on. The krama was going on before we were even aware that there was a krama going on. When the individual soul evolved in consciousness from that of an amoeba to a one-celled animal, or whatever the current understanding of the evolution of species is concerned. Right, to come to the complex form that is in the human body and the human mind, and so on. So it's a long process over billions and billions of millions, anadi bahirmukh. So anadi bahirmukh. But somehow or another, at some point, that bahirmukhata, that absorption in the non-Brahman, is changed through association, through the penetration of the Swarup Shakti into the material world. The penetration of the Swarup Shakti into the darkness of ignorance that is material consciousness. So now when that Swarup Shakti enters, then what does that do? It gives you faith. That's the first thing that happens. So faith is the first real manifestation of the Swarup Shakti. And then when one has faith, then one can engage in sadhana. In the Yoga Shastra also talks about faith. Now, faith is like a mother that protects the fledgling yogi, right? The baby yogi, the beginner yogi. That faith impels him along the path of sadhana. Well, and so, even in the Yoga Sutra, right? Even in the Yoga Sutra, there's a doctrine of grace. Because it says Ishvara Pranidhanad Va. Right? So before saying that the topic there in the first chapter of the Yoga Sutra is that through self-control, through abhyas and vairagya, one will be able to stop the actions of the chitta vritti nirodha. So chitta vritti nirodha was the definition of yoga. So the next thing that Patanjali does is to tell you what the chitta vrittis are. And then the next thing he has to do is tell you how to do how does nirodha come about. So the first thing he does, he says that abhyasa vairagyena tan nirodha. It's through practice and through renunciation that one stops the activities of the mind. But then after that, he says, Ishvara pranidhanadva, after explaining what is vairagya and what is abhyasa. So abhyasa means a yatna, it means an effort. Vairagya means detachment from the non-samadhi, you could say. And abhyasa is the continued effort to fix the mind in samadhi. Wherever the mind wanders due to its flickering and inconstant nature, from there bring it back. That's abhyasa. Tatra stitau yatnaha abhyasa. Sa nairantarya nairantarya satkrita. Anyway, abhyasa, by continuing to follow the practices, by continued effort over a long period of time. Dirgha kala sevita. Dirga Kala Sevita. Nairantari. Constant effort, 24 hours a day. There's only one effort, to turn the mind towards God, to turn the mind towards the self, to stop the activities of the mundane mind. One is persistent in one's practice, just as a Olympic athlete is persistent in his practice, whose every activity, his eating, his sleeping, everything is measured to highlight, to increase his performance. So an ordinary devotee is also abhyartha kalatvam. He's in the same way. Through abhyasa, he is constantly fighting the tendencies of rajas and tamas in order to fix his mind. So the warrior spirit comes in there, the spirit of effort, yatna, and that yatna, not just the one-off shot of the enthusiastic beginner, but nairantarya, dirga kala sevita. This is the way that abhyasa has to be done. So abhyasa and vairagya, they're both, it's a strong medicine, but it's medicine that requires ichha shakti. It's a medicine that requires willpower. Ultimately, where does that willpower come from? Then he says, Ishvara pranidhanadva. The Ishvara pranidhanadva means that you're taking shelter. Pranidhana. What is this word pranidhana? The commentaries are, trying to figure out what is the word pranidhana. But the basic part of pranidhana is dha. So pranidhana is one of those, words based on the root dha, which means to place. So when you're putting yourself, Ishvara pranidhanadva, so it's the idea is that one places oneself. The idea there is surrender. So all the paths ultimately talk about both surrender and effort. And if one does not give equal strength to both, because if one says that through faith that one is saved and not through works, then what is the point of faith if there are no works that are formed by faith? Right? If your activities do not reflect your state of faith, if you haven't become holy through abhyasa, through sadhana, through whatever ritual performance that your particular path has prescribed for you. So I'm just saying here that why not reach the destination immediately? In a sense, you could say that one is at wherever one is, right? And I say, Yeyathamam prapadyante tastataiva bhajamyaham mama vartmanu vartante manusha partha sarvasha. So everybody's following God's path. They're just at different places because of the different degree of their surrender to Him. So those who are totally non-surrendered to Him are totally immersed in the gunas of material nature. But those who, somewhere along the line in a previous life, have come into contact with the Vaishnavas and started their trip towards God, they have maybe been practicing their sadhana after receiving that mercy thousands and thousands of lifetimes. Nevertheless, what happens is that when you take a human form of life, when you take this particular form of life, then everything again starts anew. It's as though nothing had happened before. It's you're experiencing life anew, but you're experiencing life anew with the baggage of the millions of lifetimes that you've already lived. And those millions, what does that mean? Those millions of lifetimes, those are vasanas, those are your tendencies, those are your instincts. That's what makes, one person a doctor and another person a lawyer and another person, where the free choice is there, they still become different individuals. But some people don't get that degree of choice. Well, that's the result of karma, right? That's what we're talking about, karma. So the bhakta also has his bhakti sukriti, and that bhakti sukriti results in his taking a convenient birth, just like explained at the end of the 6th chapter in the Gita. He's born in the family of a yogi. Nothing could be better than to be born in the family of a yogi, to be born in the family of a sadhaka, and to be a sadhaka from one's very birth, to have contact with Guru from the very birth, to have a contact of the Sadguru, of the transcendental Guru, because one's parents are both yogis, because both parents are sadhakas, because both parents are striving for the ultimate reality. What greater mercy could there be than this? But it's the result, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, of having practiced yoga but not achieved perfection. One gets the chance. Yatate satato bhuya. He tries again for the siddhi that he was awakened to in previous lifetimes. But he doesn't start from zero. He can't start from zero. He has to start from where he is. But the process takes place in such a way that it appears to be happening for the first time. And it's experienced as though it was happening for the first time. Because if it wasn't experienced that way, it wouldn't have the same impact. The whole point is for things to have an impact. Right? This is why the Christians are so addicted to this idea of salvation through surrendering oneself to Jesus, right? To being the being born again experience. And so it's many times Christians, they go through that, they want to go through that born again experience again and again. That it's kind of like a drug that they want to have that. And so they they fall into to this kind of self-loathing. I'm such a sinner. And then when I'm such a sinner, I'm so much in need of salvation. And then this is they aggravate this kind of state of consciousness until they work up a frenzy. Right? So that idea of being a sinner and being in need of salvation, and then the release that comes when one is saved. That's a kind of an addictive thing. But this is not a good thing, really. You want to have the devotees in Krishna consciousness also, we want to experience ecstasies. And so we chant the holy name every day in the association of devotees, because that's the way that we promote our divine consciousness. At any rate, so I think my time is up here. I'm going to chant the kirtan. So the point was, after all that, the mercy that Ajamila received made him engage in practice, in abhyasa, because that's what he did. He became a yogi and he engaged in abhyasa and vairagya until his chitta, he achieved nirodha of the chitta and atma samadhi. So he'd followed the process of yoga. But at that point, the Guru, in the form of the Vishnu Dutas, appeared to him again. And this time they placed him on a golden chariot and took him to Bhagavan. So the work that he did could only take him so far. After that, it was grace. But don't think that there is no action or no sadhana after receiving grace. Sadhana is the bliss. Sadhana is the reward that is given to us by grace. And if you have the good fortune to see the ultimate goal, then you should go for it. Because that's not given to everybody. If you see sadhyo, if you can understand what the ultimate mukti is, then you go for sadhyo mukti. You go directly for the goal. Why go stupidity of going through the intermediate steps? So for us, Brahma Gyan and Atma Gyan are subsidiary to bhakti, but they are present, just like the Saraswati is present at Prayag. They are present within Bhagavat realization. And one should know that. One should have that consciousness, especially as a sadhaka. One should have that consciousness. Once you become a gopi, then don't worry about it anymore. But while you're a sadhaka, these things are well worth reflecting upon. Jai Jai Sri Radhe. Okay. Jai Jai Radhe Krishna Govind, Jai Jai Radhe Krishna Govind, Radhe Govind, Radhe Govind, Radhe Govind, Radhe Govind, Radhe Govind, Radhe Govind. Jai Jai Radhe Krishna Govind, Jai Jai Radhe Krishna Govind. Jai Jai Shyam Sundar Madan Mohan Vrindavana Chandra, Jai Jai Radha Ramana Ras Bihari, Sri Gokulananda, Jai Jai Radha Kanta Radha Vinod, Shri Radha Govinda, Jai Jai Raseshwari Vinodini, Bhanukula Chandra, Jai Jai Lalita Vishakari, Nyoto Saki Vrinda, Jai Jai Sri Rupa Manjari Adi, Manjari Ananga, Jai Jai Purnamasi Kundalata, Jaya Nandi Vrinda Tomra Kripa Kori Deo He Jugal, Charanaravinda Deo Jugal, Charanaravinda Deo Jugal, Charanaravinda Deo Jugal, Charanaravinda. Jai Jai Radhe Krishna Govinda, Jai Jai Radhe Krishna Govinda, Radhe Govinda, Radhe Govinda, Radhe Govinda, Radhe Govinda, Radhe Govinda. Jai Jai Radhe Krishna Govind, Jai Jai Radhe Krishna